Okay, here we have a task 1, and our task says the graph below shows average carbon dioxide emissions per person in the United Kingdom, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal between 1967 and 2002. And as always, what you need to do is summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Okay, so let's have a look at the actual chart. Let's look at the unit. The unit being used is CO2 emissions in metric tons. And on our x-axis, we have the dates, 1967 to 2010. So every point represents a decade. And if we look at the data points, we've got the UK and Sweden, and they make a nice little group because they both show a decrease. And then we've got Italy and Portugal, which can also be grouped together since they both are on the increase. Let's look at a sample introduction. The provided line chart illustrates the average emissions of the CO2 per person in 4 European countries for a 4-year period beginning in 1967. Let's see if we can make some improvements. Okay, so here's the original introduction. The provided line chart illustrates the average emissions of the CO2 per person in 4 European countries for a 40-year period beginning in 1967. Okay, so that's fine. The country names have been replaced by this phrase, 4 European countries. That's fine. The 40-year period beginning in 1967, that's fine. The provided line chart illustrates, that's okay. We can use that. We might not even actually need to use all these words. The problem really comes in here, the average emission of the CO2 per person. Here we have a noun, emission. Here we have another noun, CO2. So why do we need this preposition? Often we can just take two nouns and combine them. Like so, CO2 emission. Now, another problem is that our introduction doesn't really address the y-axis, the CO2 emissions in metric tons, and we are going to have to say what unit is used in the chart, because otherwise we're going to have to repeat this phrase again and again. So why not just say here in our introduction that the unit being used is metric tons. Okay, now moving on. We could make this even better. I mean, we can really get rid of this. We could just say illustrated is the average yearly CO2 emissions instead of the, where are we now? Oh, this one didn't actually mention yearly at all. Okay, so I put yearly in here. I thought I was referring to something else, but I wasn't. Yearly CO2 emissions in metric tons per capita. The per capita is a paraphrasing of the per person in 4 European countries over a 40-year period. Well, we can leave this out. So this gives us a more succinct introduction. We have our y-axis. We have that noun phrase, metric tons per capita. And we know what the data points are referring to, 40 European countries. And we have our x-axis, 40-year period. I changed this per person to per capita because in our task they already say per person. So let's paraphrase the per person, and that leaves us with per capita. Okay, so emissions of the CO2. By the way, CO2 doesn't need the, we don't need an article for carbon dioxide. So we've got this phrase here. The provided line chart illustrates the average yearly CO2 emissions per capita in 4 European countries for a 4-year period beginning in 1967. But we can make it even more succinct. We can simply say illustrated is the average yearly CO2 emissions per capita in 4 European countries over a 40-year period. And that'll do fine as an introduction. We don't need all these extra words. Now let's look at what's next. Here is the descriptor for the task achievement criteria. For a 5, there's no clear overview. For a 6, there's an overview with information appropriately selected. And for a 7, you present a clear overview of the main trends, differences, or stages. So, no overview means your score for task achievement is limited to a 5. And that's what we have in the sample. There's an introduction, but there's no overview. Instead, the writer wrote this all together as one paragraph. Now, this is the introduction, so let's get rid of that. That's already here. This should be a paragraph by itself, possibly together with the overview. So we could, if we use paragraphing more accurately, we could turn this into a paragraph. Now, the reason why I wrote first body paragraph is because your task is to make comparisons, and you're going to make comparisons more easily if you group your data points into 2. So those that show some similarity will go in one body paragraph, and the other ones that show their own similarities can go into a second body paragraph. So remember, we said the UK and Sweden are both decreasing and Italy and Portugal are increasing. So the UK and Sweden would make a logical group, and Italy and Portugal would similarly make a logical group. And that's kind of what we have here. We have the UK and Sweden, right? So we see in detail the CO2 emissions in the United Kingdom and Sweden had decreased, especially in Sweden. Besides the markedly lift between 1967 and 1977, it had dropped from 9 to nearly 5.5 metric tons in 40 years. On the other hand, the graph depicts the steady growth of CO2. Okay, so here we see on the other hand. So here he is talking about the second group. So this is going to be the second paragraph. So this is basically what we have to deal with in the first body paragraph. But before we get to the first body paragraph, let's address the overview. Instead of having a missing overview, why don't we just write, overall, the UK and Sweden's output shrank over the 4-decade period, whilst Italy and Portugal emitted a growing amount of greenhouse gases. So here I changed the noun to a verb. I have a synonym for emit, or rather I have a synonym for emissions. My synonym is output. I'm not using the same word again. Instead of saying 40-year period, I say the 4-decade period. And instead of referring to CO2, I mentioned greenhouse gases, giving me a bit of variety in my lexis. Okay, now getting to the first body paragraph. Remember, I separated the initial long paragraph into 2 parts because we do need to compare, and it's more difficult to compare if you don't logically group your data. So I'm grouping the UK and Sweden together because they both show an increase, and we'll get to the countries that show a decrease in just a second. So here's the original sentences, I should say. In detail, the CO2 emissions in the United Kingdom and Sweden had decreased, especially in Sweden. Besides the markedly lift between 1967 and 1977, it had dropped from 9 to nearly 5.5 metric tons in 40 years. Bit short. There is no data to describe the UK. We've got some data to describe Sweden. We've got 9 and 5.5. Nothing for the UK. Is that a problem? Yes, it's a problem. There may be no data to support the description. You're writing about the UK, but not giving data to support what you write. Meaning, again, your score is going to be limited to a 5. Okay, now this is what I would write. Here is my topic sentence. I'm going to write about the nations which saw a decline in numbers, which is the UK and Sweden. So I start off by saying looking first, and then I put in the noun phrase telling the reader what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk about nations which saw a decline in atmospheric discharge. So I'm using the word discharge instead of emissions, just again to show a little bit variety. Okay, the UK remained the main polluter throughout. And that is important because you need to present and adequately highlight key features. So if a country is in the first position, surely that is a key feature. So important to mention that. Okay, so the UK remained the top polluter throughout, despite experiencing, so here I use a participle without a subject because it's still the UK. We know the UK was the main polluter. The UK is also experiencing this decline, so I don't need a subject here. This participle is referring back to the UK there. A decline from an initial number of approximately 10.5. Don't spend too much time trying to see exactly what the number is. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to see what the number actually is. So approximately 10.5 is fine. To a final tally, so here I use a synonym for total. The synonym is tally of roughly 9. Now for Sweden, I use the adjective. Swedish emissions were in overall similar decline after a brief spike. Now, the original author of this paragraph here said markedly lift, but markedly is an adverb. Lift here, I guess, is supposed to be a noun, so that doesn't work. So instead of lift, I used spike, and I'm using an adjective, brief, not an adverb. Between 1967 and 1977, peaking, again here, it's the same as this experiencing. I'm using a participle because I'm still talking about Swedish emissions. Peaking just below the UK's output for the year. Because if we go back to our chart, whoa, here we go. This is a pretty important point, right? It's a point where Swedish emissions peaked and also where they're very close to the UK's numbers. So that's something you want to mention. Let's see. Okay, so anyway, so our sentence here says after a brief spike, and then it continues here, it dropped from second position with 9 units. Remember, we need to give data to support our description, so we need to use numbers. Now, I'm just saying units here because in our introduction, we already made it clear that the unit is metric tons. So, no need to repeat metric tons. I'm just saying 9 units. And here, I don't even repeat units because the reader knows what the unit is. Putting Sweden in last place. That's where Sweden ends up, right? An important point to mention. Now here is the writer's second body paragraph. On the other hand, the graph depicts the steady growth of CO2 emission in Italy and Portugal. The former grew from 4 to almost 8 metric tons, and the latter was 5 times as much in 1967 as in 2007. We have some good vocabulary here. We have on the other hand, which is fine. And we have depicts, which is pretty good. We have the former, which a lot of people use. And we have the latter, which is also something a lot of people use. But hey, it's accurate. Now, this is how I might reword this. The biggest reason why this needs to be reworded is because it's not exactly clear that the writer's response contains any sort of progression. Because if we look at the chart, the countries don't stay in the same positions, right? Like Portugal used to be last, they finished in 3rd place. Italy used to be 2nd. No, that's not right. Italy used to be 3rd, they ended up being in 2nd place. So you need to show progression in your response. Okay, so how I might reword this is saying, turning now to the nations which saw a growth in CO2 emissions. Italy's output doubled from 4 to 8, leaving the nation on the 2nd rung. So on the 2nd rung, or 2nd on the rung, it's just another way of saying it ended up in 2nd place. And then I used an adverb to describe what happened to Portugal, because it's similar, right? So similarly, Portugal's emissions showed no signs of abating, no signs of weakening, growing from a meager 0.5. Here I threw in a little adjective to describe the number, to finish at nearly 6, overtaking Sweden to finish 3rd. So to me at least, it's important to show the change in numbers. Who's first, who's second, who's last. Now, the original author did actually include an overview, but they left the overview to the end of the writing. I don't recommend that you do this. Don't write the overview at the end, because what if you run out of time? If you run out of time, then it means that your writing is not going to include an overview, which is going to limit your score for task achievement to a 5. But anyway, this is what the writer wrote. We can observe from the chart that the CO2 emissions in 4 countries were quite apart originally. Quite apart. Maybe they should say quite far apart. Quite far apart originally. But in the year of 2007, the year doesn't take off. The year 2007, the number became closer and closer. The number. Now, why is it number? Because there are 4 numbers, right? The numbers became closer and closer. Okay. I don't know if I would say closer and closer. I would say the gap narrowed. Or perhaps the gap between the numbers narrowed. 2007, let's have a look at that. Oh, here. Well, I don't know if that's really true, because this narrowing of the gap didn't happen in 2007, as he said, or she said, I don't know. It already started here, right? So saying that the narrowing of the gap occurred in 2007 is not true. It started before that. Interestingly, in 2007, the average CO2 emissions in the UK was equal to that in Portugal. The average CO2 emissions in the UK was equal to, okay. I don't know. I would say the average CO2 emissions of the UK was equal to that of Portugal. Let's see if that's true. UK, Portugal. What? In the Portugal, obviously the person misread the chart. This is Sweden. This is Portugal. So they got confused between red and green. I don't know. Maybe the person is colorblind. I'm not sure. Here is an alternative response. Here we have our introduction and our overview. We have the first body paragraph, second body paragraph, total of 206 words. I do like this format of 3 paragraphs, and I suggest you do the same. Okay, so let's go through this. The line paragraph gives information about how much carbon dioxide, CO2. Oh my goodness, is it necessary to repeat this? No, it's not. Let's get rid of that. how much carbon dioxide which each person emissions. We don't need this relative pronoun. Each person emissions. Now, if you look at the task, it says per person. Per person doesn't mean each person. Per person is an average, right? So how much carbon dioxide? So let's change this into is emitted per person, if you really want to do it in this way. Is emitted per person. Let's get rid of this. Is emitted per person in 4 different countries over a period of 40 years. Alright, I don't know why this is not a capital letter. Overall, there was a general decline in the production of CO2. I guess it doesn't matter if it's capitalized or not. In the UK and Sweden, let's put a comma here, whereas the figure for Italy and Portugal increased steadily. Alright, there we go. A little bit better. I'm not going to rewrite the whole thing. I already wrote my version. Let's just make some error correction here. In the first years, 1967. Now, why is this he plural? Well, 1967 is 1 year. And if you say the first year, do you really need the 1967 part? It's the same thing, right? In the first year, the emission of CO2 in Italy stood at 4.2. That's very good. Then it went up smoothly. Okay, I do like this smoothly. Was it smooth? Up to you to decide if this is smooth or not. And reached a peak of 7.8 in 1977. Is this true? Looks to be true. Likewise, why is this not capitalized? The figure for Portugal was lower in the beginning of the year. Again, the year. Why is this the year if it's a 40-year period? It's not the year. Which accounted for 1. Which just accounted for 1. Okay. This person really seems to have a problem with punctuation. Next, there was an increase to 5 in the production of CO2. Oh, I guess he's still talking about Portugal, right? To 5. To 5. Next. Well, this is not really next. This is at the end of the period, but alright. I don't know. The next part bothers me, because if you start in the beginning, the next is not the end. Next would be here or in the middle somewhere. So maybe they should use a different word for next. There was an increase to 5 in the production of CO2 and remained stable. This verb needs a subject throughout the remainder of the period. Wait, am I wrong? Am I reading this incorrectly? Are we talking about Portugal? Yes, it's Portugal. There was an increase to 5 and it remained stable throughout the remainder of the period. 5 is about here. I guess next is 1977 then. It's not really clear to me what this next is. See, using next is so vague, it's problematic. I thought initially he was talking about 2007. I guess not. Alright, anyway, moving on. I mean, the grammar and everything is fine. It's just this is confusing. With regard to the UK, in 1967, the emission of CO2 was quite higher than that of other countries. Quite higher. I don't know if I would say quite higher. How about substantially higher? And how about saying how much than that of the other countries? We're talking about specific countries, right? So we're talking about just 3 other countries. But after that, so after 1967, after that, okay, there was a gradual decline to nearly 8 at the end of a period. Let's change this to the end of the period. It's a specific period, right? although the two trends in the UK, isn't it the same trend or similar in terms of general decline? Oh, okay, he distinguishes them. The two trends in the UK and Sweden were similar in trend. The two trends in the UK and Sweden were similar. Oh, I can't read. Were similar in terms of general decline. Oh, that's a very good phrase. Similar in terms of general decline. Good, good, good. The production of CO2 in Sweden varied more significantly than the figure for the UK. Okay, grammar is very good. It reached the highest point of over 10. This is Sweden, right? Sweden over 10. Okay, there we go. That's 1977. Then it decreased rapidly by over 6 in 2007. It's a pity they said in, because it didn't decrease only in 2007, right? It didn't fall from 10 to... I don't understand. Where does this number 7 come from? Oh, 6. It decreased by over 6. Okay. 6. I guess 11 to 5 is 6. Okay. But anyway, this decline didn't happen in 2007. It didn't fall from 11 to 5 in 2007. It fell to 5 by 2007. By. The end result happened here. But not everything happened in 2007. So that's the wrong preposition. Which is in the same level of Portugal. Which is in the same level of Portugal. Same level as Portugal. Okay, true, but wrong word. Which is at same level. Which is at the same level as Portugal. Is at the same level of Portugal. It's the same level as Portugal. Portugal's level, because we are describing level and level. So Portugal's level. Here is a third response. You can see 3 paragraphs coming in at 191 words. Let's have a look at the introduction. This line graph shows carbon dioxide emissions per person among 4 countries covering the period from 1967 to 2007. Fair enough. I don't see any paraphrasing going on here, but okay, let's move on. Overall, it's clear to see. I would avoid using the phrase "it's clear to see" because very often in task 1, things are not clear. So why don't we say, leave that out. Overall, the United Kingdom had the largest grades. Why are there 3 superlatives here? Good grief. Let's get rid of these. I don't know why there are so many. Let's choose one. Let's choose the middle one. Greatest. Had the greatest CO2 emissions, followed by a deep dip. But that, what do you mean? Followed by? Followed by means a specific event happened, which was followed by another specific event. If you say overall, well, that's a general trend. A general trend cannot be followed by anything. A general trend is the general overall trend. Overall means from here to here. There's nothing following 2007. It's the last date on our x-axis. This is not right. Followed by a deep dip. Also, where was the deep dip? I don't see a deep dip here. There's just a gradual decline. So I don't know. I don't want to rewrite this because I don't know what the writer saw that I cannot see. I don't see a deep dip. I don't see anything after 2007. So I'm just going to delete that. I don't know what that is about. Whereas there was a significant growth in Sweden. But why use whereas? Because here you say Oh, I guess the whereas was okay, so let's bring back that deleted part. Okay, so despite, let's say despite a gradual decline. I don't see any deep dips. Despite that decline, let's get rid of this. Okay, whereas. Okay, now the whereas makes sense, because here we have a decline, here we have growth. Whereas there was a significant growth. I think growth, let's drop the article. There was significant growth in Sweden. In Sweden's numbers, not in Sweden. Sweden's numbers before dropping dramatically. Right, dramatic fall. All right, that makes sense. However, there were steady increases in Italy and Portugal. Increases, I see. There was significant growth. Well, here he uses the word however. So I guess the however is because there was a change here, whereas here the trend was steady. In Sweden's numbers before dropping dramatically, however, there were steady increases in Italy and Portugal. Again, it's not in Italy and Portugal. It's in Italy and Portugal's, let's say, output or emissions or whatever. Okay. Looking at the line graph in more detail. All right, it's a very standard phrase. The level of CO2 emission in the UK held steady at about 10.8 tons between 1967 and 1977. Yeah, I guess that's true. After that, there was a slow decrease to 8.2 tons in the following years. True, although I'm not sure where this ends. Okay. Sweden released, oh goodness, okay, here we see some variety in vocabulary. 8.2 tons of CO2 emissions in 1967 before reaching now see here, remember when I talked about participles, I said the noun or the subject rather, it's got to be the same subject. So Sweden released, so Sweden reached. But here it doesn't work because Sweden didn't reach a high point. It's Sweden's emissions. This participle is referring to a different noun. It's not referring to Sweden, it's referring to Sweden's emissions. So you might want to change this to before the level or the output or something similar. And then we have to go to reached, a high point. A high point. You could say high point, but why not just say high? Reached a high of 10.2 tons in 1977. Whoa, this sentence is extremely long, isn't it? Oh no, it's not. Here it started. For a second I thought the sentence was too long. Okay, in 1977, and it was then plummeting at 7 tons in 1987. 87, Sweden. It's about 7, right? I don't know why the continuous is used here. Why not just say plummeted? And it then plummeted. Plummeted is a word that is often used. I guess here plummet is used correctly. Plummeted to, not at, 7 tons in 1997. Towards the end of the timeline, a gradual decline can be observed. Ooh, I do like this sentence. Can be observed. What a nice word to use, observed. Alright, following a similar pattern, there was just over 4 tons of emissions in 1967 in Italy. Following a similar pattern. Similar to what? I don't know, similar to what? Because Sweden and the UK, down. Similar trend. Italy's going up. What is similar there? I don't know. There was just over 4 tons of emissions in 1967 in Italy. There was only over 4 tons. There was just over 4 tons. Why don't we say only 4 tons. Let's get rid of that. Only 4 tons of emissions were released in 1967 in Italy. After which experiencing. See, now this has to refer to the same noun. Now here our noun is 4 tons. So that doesn't work. After which the number slightly increased. After which the number slightly increased. Slightly increased to what? The number slightly increased. I don't know. Is this slight? It went from 4 to 6. It's like 50%. Is that slight? The number slightly increased before growing steeply during 1977 to 1997. Steep. Now, why is this slight and this is steep? I don't understand. This slight, steep. These seem to be the wrong words. I think this should go here. The number steeply increased before growing. I don't know. Let's choose a different word. Let's choose the adverb moderately. Growing moderately during 1977 and remaining. Well, here we have too many nouns. We can't use this because does it refer to the number? Does it refer to the 4 tons? So let's go to remained. Remained constant at nearly 8 tons between 1997. Okay, well that's true. It's pretty constant, right? Nearly 8 tons. Portugal. Whoa, not a lot of information on Portugal. All right, Portugal's emission. Why not make that plural? Went up slightly until 1997 before stabilizing. Went up slightly. Good grief. This is slight? I don't understand the adverbs that this person is using. Why is that slight? To me, this is the most dramatic increase. It went from 1 to 4. That's like or 5 maybe. That's like a 500% increase. How is that slight? To me, that's very dramatic. Dramatically. But there are no numbers really to describe the numbers. Went up dramatically from 1 to, what was it? From 1 to 5. Throw in some numbers to describe your data for stabilizing. Alright, so if you don't want to say where it ended up, I guess it's okay. At least you have these numbers here, the 1 to the 5, or 1 to 5, to describe your data. But maybe add something at the end.